Okay, this is going to be a little different than the things that you've seen today because what I'm going to be speaking about is brain-centric design, which is a pedagogic model in the learning sciences of cognitive neuroscience. And even though that's a mouthful, I'm going to make it very simple today because instead of just talking about the actual thing that I do, I'm going to put you inside the model. Most of what we learn in school is in a behaviorist model, a rewards and punishment model, where you've got a sage on the stage, and regardless of the tools they're using, primarily they take up that hour and then they ask for questions. And this is a much different model, and it's based off of a book that we put together just before COVID hit that was called Brain-Centric Design. It's the surprising neuroscience behind learning with deep understanding. And it's key because what it is a recipe for making new information available and to be processed by another's brain. So it's not just school, it's sales, it's management meetings, it's your kids. I homeschooled 4 kids, I'm a single dad, they all went to college, they all done very well in life. And as we put this book out, we're now in thousands of schools, we've got tens of thousands of teachers, we've got a 1,500 person institute going on right now at Pacific Lutheran University in Washington with my colleague, Dr. Carr. And specifically, this is the learning sciences in cognitive neuroscience. And it takes up an hour. I'm going to use an hour as a use case. This is only 30 minutes, but I'll show you how an hour is actually divided up. And it works for any possible subject matter. It's agnostic to any subject matter or age. Because it's a recipe. And a recipe, as you know, if you want to repeat, say, chocolate chip cookies, Nestle's puts that on the yellow bag for you. If in this case, we're going to make broccoli salad, if you want that broccoli salad to turn out the same way every single time, you use the right ingredients in the right order at the right time, and you have broccoli salad. The problem with learning and thinking is that you've never been taught to think. Think about that. Never been taught to think. Your brain does this automatically. It's hardwired to think. It's hardwired to learn. And you really learn if you have fun at it. If you're not having fun, then you're doing something wrong. In fact, it's impossible to learn if you're in your amygdala. And I won't use a lot of brain science words, but amygdala, or what we call Amy in our classes. In fact, we don't even call our classes classes. We call them a learning space. And Amy is your gatekeeper. And if she's excited, nothing gets past. And we'll get into that a little deeper as we move forward. Now let's take a look at the classroom. 150 years ago, this is your classroom. And about 50% of the people walked out of there with whatever it is you were trying to learn. Now with millions of dollars and all these technology today, let's look at that same classroom. Nothing's changed. There's still a teacher at the beginning. We're still sitting in the background. We may have tools and computers and different things that are good for learning, but the result is kind of not the same. We're still having the same amount of dropouts. We have more people having problems with skills-based. The teachers are mad, the schools are mad, and we're trying to find ways to get about making this happen. So it isn't so much the classroom, it's the genetic makeup of how that material is provided so that the brain can process it. And that's what we're going to go through in this challenge. Now, I call it a challenge because I want you personally involved in what's going to happen over the next couple minutes. The challenge is, how can understanding how the brain processes information make me a better educator? So you were each handed out this piece of paper here. It's called the Cognitive Rehearsal Worksheet. Cognitive rehearsal really means thinking about practicing thinking. And I'm going to want you to write some things down. In fact, I'll even give you time, and this is how we do it in a classroom. You're in the model right now, what we call the learning space. So let's take the next minute, and on this piece of paper, I would like you to write your own personal thoughts. You have a minute to do so, and write your thoughts about how understanding how the brain processes information can make me a better educator. Take 1 minute. Go. 30 seconds. Ten seconds. Novelty. Kids love novelty, adults love novelty. In fact, it's kind of funny because when you look at that classroom, never in the world I have 4 kids, did they ever sit down for an hour and pay attention. I don't know why we ask them to do that in school, because really the secret to getting them involved is if you can give them autonomy, mastery, and purpose. That's Pink's work, but it's never been so true than today, because a lot of times we are on our own. Now, this model works live, it works in online, it's an asynchronous tool. We've got a platform that's global. We're on every continent in the US, or in the in the globe. Get it right here. And this is the model that you see here. There we go. This is the actual model you're in right now. We just finished this highlight part. That's called initial thoughts. And this is where the teacher, the educator, the facilitator will come in, and they'll introduce the subject. They'll analogize the subject so that we can anchor it in something the audience knows. And then we'll give them a piece of disequilibrium, meaning it's going to hit personal to them, like the classroom. We don't sit in that classroom. And right between this part and the next part, which is called multiple perspectives, is when we ask the challenge question and we make it personal. The question about the content must be personal to the person taking it. So since I'm showing you brain science today, or brain-centric design, I asked you how can understanding how brain processes information can make me a better educator. So we're all educators. We as educators can make education more fun, and you wrote down your own thoughts. This was not me dictating your thoughts, it was you writing down your own thoughts. So let's see how this works through the multiple perspectives, and these are the items that I'm going to cover very quickly for you, but in a nice 30,000-foot view. The big idea, the nested egg, Miller's Law, the challenge wheel, and Amy, the amygdala. The big idea is something that most educators or curriculum fail to touch on. Now, a lot of time we'll say, hey, this is about neuroscience. But if I say it's about neuroscience, you can't comprehend that. That's a huge, huge, huge subject. It needs to be brought down. And in my case, I said it's the learning sciences and cognitive neuroscience. But in this case, I'm just showing you how the brain processes information so that you can take your life's experience and put it against these multiple perspectives, and you can make up your own world of what the processing information is. But you have to have a big idea, and it has to be defined. Before you start even building the curriculum, you must have some sort of measurement. So if I teach this, how do I know people actually got it? How do I know people made sense of it? And if you think of that term, made sense, that literally means to attach all your senses to the learning. This is called Hebb's rule in neuroscience. Neurons that fire together, wire together. And really what that means to the layman is when I go into multiple perspectives, I'm going to have each and every person in my learning space see it, feel it, touch it, talk about it, strategize about it. Or if I talked about neuroscience lobes, I would do the occipital lobe, that means I'm watching. I would do the temporal lobe, that means I'm listening. The parietal lobe, that means I've got small motor skills, I'm looking at it in a different way. And most importantly, for engagement, the true definition of engagement is when your prefrontal cortex is strategizing, generating future thought, thinking about how this makes for you. So that challenge question literally puts you in your PFC because it was about you and you were writing down your own thoughts. That's your baseline measurement. Now, once I've got a big idea and a measurement, I come to the nested egg. Now, the nested egg happens before the learning ever happens. This is when I take all my concepts and I put them in an order that the brain will process it. This is how it works. I'll show you in a couple different ways how it works. First of all, we take all the concepts we want to teach, whether it's an hour, a week, a month, an entire catalog of courses, and we write them into this circle. And we always make learning visible. Always, because we can't remember it all. We have this thing called a working memory. And if your working memory was the size of a 1 square foot box, any idea of how large your brain is with its billions and billions of neurons, how large it is compared to just the part that pays attention? 1 square foot. I won't ask any questions here, I'll just tell you. It's the size of 3 Milky Ways. The brain's a pretty big deal, and I'm only talking about the learning part of the brain. And we want to make sure people can process the information. So the first thing we do as educators is we write down all the concepts we're going to teach. Now, from those concepts, we ask one question. It's kind of the elevator's pitch in sales. So I say, okay, out of these 400 concepts I've got here, what one thing must they know? What's one thing must they know? What would they walk away with when my class is done? That's your big idea. Now, furthermore, from those same concepts, we'll pull 2 more ideas out of this. And I'll ask the question, with that big idea, what 2 things must they know to understand this big idea? Now, I'm only using small numbers, and I'll explain why. It's Miller's Law. Most of you are probably familiar with it, but if you're not, I'll show you what that is. You got your big idea, then you've got your 2 scaffolding ideas. The rest of the concepts in that larger circle need to then be scaffolded under those 2 thoughts. And if they're done properly, you can remember an infinite amount of things. This can go on for an hour, a day, a week, 17 weeks. We just did a class at Aetna, the insurance company. It was 17 weeks long. They asked us to redo it. When we redid it, it was 12 weeks long. And the reason is we got all of the weeds through this process. The results of it were fantastic, and I'll go over those in a little bit. But again, in the first circle, we do the concepts to be uncovered. This is for your course or presentation. That second one, the big idea, is what they must walk away with. So if I was successful, we didn't give them a grade or a percentage or a letter or anything like that. What are they walking away with? Third thing, what 2 things must they know to achieve this big idea? And the final thing, which is, of course, scaffolding the remaining concepts. Now, I told you my colleague is in Pacific Lutheran University right now at the Neuroscience Institute, or at the Pacific Lutheran University at the Neural Education Institute as this is going on. His name is Dr. Kiran Omani, and he'll explain this just a little better than I did.
As learning scientists, we like to look at models that have meaning, particularly for the end user, which could be the learner or the student or the adult learner. And so in this case, we're looking at the nested egg. So the nested egg looks like it's an egg within an egg within an egg, 3 layers deep. The small inside circle is the one that's the most important. That's the one with the enduring idea, or sometimes we call that the big idea. And the big idea is nothing more than distilling all the information and figuring out that at the end of this class, when I'm finished teaching this, whatever I'm teaching, that subject area, that the person will walk away and they will know that one big idea. And the big idea then is something that I know when I'm walking into my class. I've already planned this, and it's very obvious that this is what I want my students to understand. So the second part then is there's an awful lot of material and there's little time. So it's a big constant problem with education, is that we have so much content and so little time. And if we do the nested egg and the big idea and the backwards design, if we do all of these things correctly, then it doesn't matter how much information, as long as we know what we're doing in our planning and our implementation of that model. So the model basically is this. You've got the big idea, 2 scaffolding ideas that will help us understand that big idea, and then each of the individual bits of information, and there can be thousands of bits of information, are connected through the scaffolding ideas to the big idea. And we have lots of examples of this in play. We can show you all kinds of big ideas connected to extraneous or ancillary pieces of information. And as long as they make sense through that central connecting what I call scaffolding idea, then the brain can handle it. And the reason this happens is got to do with the working memory space. Now, if we can back up for 1 second and talk about the idea that we do have a limitation to our working memory space. Most people, in fact, have very small working memory spaces. And as teachers and as parents, one of the tasks that we have and we can do is to increase our students' working memory space by doing certain intentional activities that help to grow the neural structures that grow and make and expand the working memory space. It's not difficult, but we do have to have a mental model that understands what's going on.
That's from our certification, which we do across the globe, of course. But the important thing here is what you're seeing is cognitive rehearsal. I've said it in one voice. Kieran said it in another voice. I showed it to you in a different kind of graphic. I'm repeating the same thing, but saying it in a different way. Miller's Law. It's probably the most quoted paper in all of psychology. It should be used in all learning. It's often not. And this goes back to working memory, or in popular speech, that would be paying attention. Miller's Law means you can only understand 7 plus or minus 2 concepts at any given time. Now, this is when he did it back in like 1950. This is not new information. But since then, it has been redone. It was redone about 15 years ago. They redid the entire study the way he did, and it's now 4 plus or minus 2. So when we're doing a class, the reason I showed you that nested egg was it takes 2 scaffolding ideas. That's all they think they're learning because everything else is under that. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. If I gave you this number to memorize right now, and gave you a couple seconds to memorize, how many people could do it? That's not a question in saying raising your hand, but it's just looking at it. And you're looking at it and right away you're struggling because it's just too much information. I've already broke your working memory by giving you too much information. If I broke this information down, it might be a little easier for you to remember it. Now you're remembering it in chunks. Sometimes Miller's Law is called chunking. This is how your phone number was developed, as 3 pieces of information. You got your prefix, those first 3 numbers, and those last 4 numbers always act as one item. That's why you can remember your phone number. But if I broke these numbers down even further, you'll see that you can remember it easily, and not only can you remember it easily, you'll start seeing a pattern, and when you see the pattern, you'll see all the things underneath the number. 1066, Battle of Hastings, lots of information under there. 1492 is Columbus, 1776, Independence, 1945, World War I, 1969, we all land on the moon. I can say 1969, most people in this class will be able to rattle off a lot of stuff about that year. And that's how Miller's Law and working memory works, especially in the learning space. Now, when we go further, once we have our information in the right order, we can then build the class and present it as such. And again, we're in this second part. We started in this first part, which is called initial thoughts. And again, this is when you open up the learning, you give an introduction that's very blunt as to what it is, you give an analogy of that introduction so people can go, oh yeah, it's kind of like that. I said this is kind of like a recipe. And then you give disequilibrium. I talked about the classroom, and the classroom hasn't changed. We're trying to throw technology and all these other things at it, which are very good for learning, but when I say the classroom hasn't changed, it's not really directed towards the one thing we're actually trying to change. We may see people, but I'm saying the brain. Everybody has a brain. All brains process information the exact same way, unless it's a damaged brain, of course. What happens, though, is when you get into the middle of that limbic brain, where all the emotions and all the weird things happen, your thoughts and experiences of your life to that point are attached to that concept. So it is up to we, as educators, to give it to them in a piece where they can process it every time. And this does work every time. I'll give you some numbers as to how this works in business and school as we go forward. Second part of the model, if this was in a 1-hour class, would be 15 to 20 minutes of multiple perspectives, which you're in right now. You're seeing the same thing from different places. And I'm not covering information. I'm presenting perspectives for you to uncover the information, which I'll show you how you'll do it here in a moment. The third item is what follows directly after multiple perspectives, which is a 2-minute break for you to do what every computer in the world does, and that is reflect. Or in computer language, it would be random access memory. Makes everything come together. Except we scaffold questions here too. Rather than tell your class to reflect, they've never been taught to reflect, most of them. So we give them 3 questions, and those 3 questions are on your cognitive rehearsal worksheet. They've not yet been filled out because we haven't got to this place yet. After that reflection period, there's about a 15-minute period where we break up into groups, and in those groups, there are assigned roles of taskmaster, scribe, and spokesperson. And then finally, after these groups, are done talking with each other with these questions, because what happens, if you've noticed, like at lunchtime when you sat at round tables and how lively the conversation was, that's when you started processing the learning, you were having fun. Oh, I saw Gail speak about Kyle, and that thing she said about the way he looked at construction was spot on. Or this morning it was Christine with the VR, same thing. VR can be a wonderful perspective, but you're talking about it and you're going, yeah, this is the way it worked for me. I mean, I've got a Kyle in my class. That's where the revised thinking happens. And the scribe in that group is writing all this down. And then finally, at the end of that 15 minutes, there's a report out. Now let's just say we had 25, 30 people in the class and we broke it into 5 groups, 5, 6 people per group. The spokesman stands up, and this is the first time we went from an I, which was the entire model, it was just me and my initial thoughts, me and look at it multiple perspectives, me and my reflections. Now I'm in revised thinking, talking with the group, and this is where the report out happens. And this is magical. This is a magical part of a learning space, because I look at a class with just 2 kinds of people. There are dandelions and there are orchids. And if you're familiar with Boyce's work called The Dandelion and the Orchid, it's an amazing way to look at the world, and I can give you a quick example of how it works, because the book is fabulous, but it's pretty thick, heavy reading. What it comes down to, there are 2 types of people, dandelions and orchids, and think of your own family. The dandelion is the person that can do basically anything you throw at them. Doesn't matter. You know, they don't sleep all night, they're hungover, it's COVID, they can still perform C grade or better if you're grading. They can perform. The dandelion, if you look at them wrong, they wilt. Just like the flower. I mean, they need the right pH, they need the right water, they need the right sunlight, and this model is for the dandelion. This is a psychologically safe model. And that doesn't mean we're speaking down, because your dandelions are your Steve Jobs of the world. They are people that are brilliant, but they don't want to be put on a spot. They're the last person in class you want to call on and say, Bob, what's your answer to number 3? Well, immediately, Bob gets thrown into his amygdala. He freaks out. It's like if I asked any of you, hey, what's your favorite song? You know, all of a sudden you're on guard. And that's your amygdala. That you can't learn when that thing is hyperactive or aiming. So that's the report out piece of this. And what they do is they stand up and they say, we, as the GFEL learners, you give your name a group, think that this was surprising. We thought we saw things this way, but now we see them in a different light. And what we still need help with is X. Nobody's been put on the spot in that situation. They've done it as a group consensus, and they even named themselves that way. And that orchid in the group, maybe he wasn't the spokesman, but when the spokesman was up there speaking and he said, hey, I thought this was surprising, the orchid heard his words, and he's like, yeah, that's a hit of dopamine. That's me. I said that. Now, he didn't have to get up and say it, but he was a part of it. And not only that, but Sherry said this one thing that she knew before but now sees in a different light. And I'm looking at that going, oh boy, that's something I've never thought about that. That's my learning now too. Just like at your lunchroom table, where the learning actually happens. You got all these perspectives in the morning, they served you lunch, you sat at a group and you talked about everything. You processed that information. Then at the end of the hour, they give a break. We tune into some things called long-term potentiation, and things work. To be a zebra, the reason I bring this up is it comes from Robert Sapolsky. He's a neuroscientist at Stanford. And I keep saying that if the amygdala is hyperactive, you cannot learn. And I refer to everything in science. I just don't use all the big words because, you know, nobody wants to talk about fusiform gyrus. It just makes me sound smart, but you can't really apply it. But Robert Sapolsky does some really wonderful things with neuroscience, and he specifically talks about the PFC with humans. We're the only animal that has one. We're the only animal that can strategize in the way that we do. And this is a quick snippet of him. He spends several months in the African Serengeti. He studies baboons. He kind of looks like a baboon. He's kind of a fun guy. But he speaks directly to hyperactive amygdalas and how folks cannot learn if they're put in a piece of stress.
What it's about is somebody is very intent on eating you, or you are very intent on eating somebody, and there's an immediate crisis going on.
When you run for your life, basics are all that matter. Lungs work overtime to pump mammoth quantities of oxygen into the bloodstream. The heart races to pump that oxygen throughout the body, so muscles respond instantly.
You need your blood pressure up to deliver that energy. You need to turn off anything that's not essential. Growth, reproduction, you know, you're running for your life. This is no time to ovulate. Tissue repair, all that sort of thing. Do it later if there is a later.
When the zebra escapes, its stress response shuts down. But human beings can't seem to find their off switch.
We turn on the exact same stress response for purely psychological states, thinking about the ozone layer, the taxes coming up, mortality, 30-year mortgages. We turn on the same stress response, and the key difference there is we're not doing it for a real physiological reason, and we're doing it nonstop. After a while, the stress response is more damaging than the stressor itself, because the stressor is some psychological nonsense that you're falling for. No zebra on Earth running for its life would understand why fear of speaking in public would cause you to secrete the same hormones that it's doing at that point to save its life.
Robert Sapolsky. Now again, we're speaking specifically of the stress response, or which I am giving credence to as far as calling it the amygdala. When we're doing teaching on the amygdala, we make everything a cartoon, and this is Amy. She's shaped like an almond. Amygdala is Latin for almond, because it's shaped like that. We have two of them. They basically work in sync, but they're a little bit different. But when you're building this class, and remember the multiple perspectives where I'm showing you these things, none of these items will include stress, worry, fear, boredom, or entrapment. Stress, worry, fear, boredom, or entrapment fires up your amygdala. And if that's in your class, if that's in your stuff, that's going to make people turn off. And you also need to understand that when these people come into your class, stuff is happening to them prior to coming into the class. There's absolutely no reason, just because they walked into your class, they're going to pay attention, unless you put them in a comfortable space where they're psychologically safe and they feel like they have autonomy, mastery, and purpose. The only way you can do that with your material is to make them think it's about them. Because everybody here in this room is all here for the same reason. You're hoping to hear me yak for 30 minutes and gain some benefit for whatever it is you do. And that's me here now. If this topic is about me here, right now, I'm in. You know, when it's personal, something gets traction. But if I'm just yapping, you're hoping, or I'm hoping you're on for the ride. You may not be. You may be on your computer, you may be texting, you may be doodling, you may be thinking about a 30-year mortgage. Maybe tonight's gambling. Doesn't matter. I'm supposed to keep you engaged in this information, and the only way I can do it is making it about you here at this very moment. So that's the way Amy works. So if I were to break into a class right now, and I'll give you 2 minutes to do this, I would love for you right now on that same cognitive rehearsal worksheet, take 2 minutes to fill out the 3 questions, which are, what was surprising? Because that's a safe question to ask anybody. What was surprising? Even if nothing was surprising, write that down. But surely you found something surprising. What did I already know but now see in a different light? Totally up to you. And that's where your thoughts and experiences as an individual come into this class, because, well, I thought this, but now I see this. And questions. What do I still need help with? If you write those down, and when we talk about it in the report out page, that's your parking lot. So rather than asking questions and putting somebody on the spot, this gets the collective conscious of the room of your learners, the collective genius of all the people and their answers together on one nice little page. So if you would take 2 minutes and write down those questions, or your answers to those questions, please do so now. 1 minute. Thirty seconds. Time. And you'll know that I gave you 2 minutes there, and prior when I gave you 1 minute, I gave you 1 minute. That's also a part of that psychologically safe session. You can trust me. I'll give you a minute, I'll give you 2 minutes, then I'll shut up. It's the hardest thing for most teachers or facilitators to do is not say something for 2 minutes, because again, we're conditioned to go in there, it's like, I've got an hour, see what I can do. So again, now we have these questions. We've got them written down, and we won't break out in these groups right now. But if we were in this model 100%, just like at lunch, I would give you 15 minutes. And for 15 minutes, you would collaborate, you would co-create, you would share your thoughts and experiences on this thing, on brain science. And that is the magic of this model, is I don't know everything, Kieran doesn't know everything, anybody up here doesn't know everything about anything. But when we can apply our own thoughts and experiences to it, that does give us that autonomy. And as I start listening to Paul talk about it in our revised thinking, that starts giving me that mastery. It's like, oh, I'm starting to get this. I'm literally starting to make sense. And the reason is instead of just being told what to remember, what to memorize, I'm being shown several different perspectives on the same concept. I'm getting to take my preference, my preferential learning style. A lot of people say they're visual learners or audio learners or tactile learners. Those are preferences. And everybody gets to win because you can play with your own style of learning in this period as you start putting things together. And again, it's collaborative, it's co-created, and it makes the room a nicer place to be. At the end of that 15 minutes, we stand up and again, we go through those same things again. Now you see a lot of repetition in this. That repetition is cognitive rehearsal. However, that cognitive rehearsal first started with me and the initial thoughts, giving them to you. Then I gave you multiple perspectives on that same subject. Then I gave you the gift of 2 minutes to actually think about it and not listen to me yammer on about the subject. So you can just nod your head and pretend you kind of get it. You can actually really think about it. Then I put you in a group of the folks, your cohort in the class or your learning space or your office or your management meeting or the sales pitch, and I gave you the opportunity to kind of talk things over, but I did so in a scaffolding way. What was surprising? Very safe. And 5 people may think of 5 different surprising things, but that's 5 different voices talking about the same thing. Then it goes to that, what did I already know but now see in a new light? Again, goes round robin around the table. You're hearing it again and again and again. And what you still need help with is going to be up to the individual. By the end of this hour, you have cognitively rehearsed this one particular item more than 30 times with 30 different voices, including your own, adding your own thoughts and experiences to it. So again, when they stand up and they report out, that's how the class thinks, and at the end of that class, we give them a break. Now, one thing I'll add to this, if we're going to give them a break and come to another class, before they leave, we do a thing called long-term potentiation, LTP. You want to look this up because it's one of the most valuable things in all of learning. We go through this, and let's just say I was going to speak in 15 minutes. I would ask you to write down or doodle one word or one little phrase or one little icon that represents your take-home from this particular session. So you might write down neuroscience, or you might doodle a bunny with ears eating a carrot for whatever reason. You might do whatever you do. You go take your break. Now, we've parked that thought on a piece of paper, and when you come back, this is how we rehearse what we learned in the last hour in my learning spaces. with the class real quickly instead of the teacher going, here's what we covered in this last hour, which is boring, and I don't want to hear that, and neither do you. What I ask for Gail to stand up, and I'll say, Gail, what was your word? And she might have said neuroscience. And I'll ask her to say, why did you write down neuroscience? She'll say, blah, 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 blah. Gail picks the next person to speak, and he says, well, I drew the bunny with the carrot. And I did that because blah, 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 blah. And what happens is your entire class rehearses that last hour or yesterday's learning for everybody else in their voice, giving them autonomy, mastery, purpose, hits of dopamine. Everybody has oxytocin, the group love neurotransmitter. I like to say I'm a dopamine dealer sometimes when I'm teaching, because really I'm just trying to get people to feel good about it. Because my motto is, if we're not having fun, then we're doing it wrong. We don't learn under stress. That's proven. It's proven a million times over. So if we take the same classroom and all we do is slightly change the way we present that information so the brain processes it, you will have retention, huge retention. In fact, the summer before COVID, we got to present at Columbia College in New York, and we reversed the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. You may know this, and you've heard it before. Don't worry about what I'm talking about. You're going to forget 80% of it by tomorrow. That's the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. This has reversed that, because what the forgetting curve is based on is memorization. In these classes, you have no memorization. You have engagement, because it's all about you right here, right now. And what happens when that happens is you become intrinsic and agentic in your learning. You want to learn more because you get this. Ooh, I'm interested in neuroscience. I'm going to read a little more about this or how this works. And that's a super duper positive thing. So in business, what that means is tons of savings. I brought up Aetna earlier, 17-week course reduced to 12 weeks. They teach this course 50 times a year. It saved $64,000 per course, and they baselined it using Kirkpatrick's levels of evaluation. So it was not just me talking, it's other people managing it. And the retention was at 103% at 9 months. 103%. Not 60% or 80%, but more than what we taught, because it became agentic. The attrition in the class, which anybody in HR will tell you is the horror of all business, because you have to hire, rehire, train again, people drop out. It was 30%, it was 2% in our classes. And the unknown thing that we didn't know came out of this when we originally started this about 6 years ago was that people love their job more, because now they're not under stress memorizing how they do it, but they're in charge of their own future, because they've been given the gift of time and space and autonomy, mastery, and purpose in a model that if you replicate it with any subject matter, and you do the same thing with the nested egg, you put it in the proper order, and you take that order and make it into multiple perspectives and place it into the model, it works every time. We're on every continent on this globe. We're in about 42 different languages with companies like Nike, and it's an amazing thing when we take that classroom and realize we're really just going for the brain. And when we started to learn how to teach, maybe that brain information wasn't there, because the 90s were kind of the decade of the brain. My former boss, Paul Allen from Microsoft, used to be his digital director of all his media propers in Portland, has started the Paul Allen Brain Institute. Tons of millions of dollars have gone into some of this research just to find out the parts of the brain that work on learning. And this is all conceptualized and put together in this book and this pedagogic model in the Learning Sciences of Cognitive Neuroscience, which is called Brain-Centric Design. So I thank you all for your time and appreciate your input, and you all have a great afternoon. Unless you have questions, you can feel, but go ahead and clap too. Thank you very much.